Today on Inside Utah Politics, the legislative session. Governor Spencer Cox has reviewed and taken action on all the legislation passed this year. He's here with his thoughts on how it all played out, including that veto override. And a budget battle in the nation's capital. The Biden administration defending the president's $5.8 trillion proposal as Republicans accuse them of wasteful spending.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin this morning with Governor Spencer Cox here to weigh in with his thoughts on the legislative session. Governor, great to have you in studio. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Glenn. It's great to be back.
Good to have you. Let's start off. You really have to start off with HB 11 because that's what really caught the attention in the waning hours of legislative session and the weeks since then. Your thoughts first on why you vetoed that bill.
Well, there were several reasons, and I laid those out in a really expansive 4.5-page letter, and I appreciate so many people that were able to read that. There were a couple big problems. One was just the process. Passing legislation that changes drastically in the last couple hours of the session is never really a good thing. I believe there needed to be time for people to weigh in. And what happens when you pass legislation, big legislation on the last night of the session that changes significantly, is you make mistakes. And the legislature admitted that they did make a big mistake in excluding school districts and the Utah High School Athletic Association from being compensated for the inevitable lawsuit that was going to happen and being indemnified. And that's exactly what happened. And so every Republican, every legislator had to vote to change the bill to make sure that we were able to defend the school and the High School Athletic Association without bankrupting them. And then, of course, just knowing that there's only one student involved, there are other lawsuits going on. My thought was, why not let those lawsuits play out so we don't have to spend millions of dollars defending those? But the legislature disagreed on that piece.
I did read your letter, and it really got into some personal feelings about this as well, and those children who this impacts. This was really a personal issue for you as well.
Well, it's a very difficult one, and I've talked about the culture wars before and how divided we are as a nation. And this is one area where I care deeply about these kids. And look, you can be on the other side of this issue and still care deeply about these kids. I'm not trying to align anyone or misalign anyone. But I do believe that we need to be thoughtful in the way that we do things. And again, having the right process and bringing everyone together, trying to find some common ground and some solutions. That's what we're working towards. And we will continue to work towards that.
Okay, Governor, let's dig into that a little more. What would be a reasonable compromise in your mind?
Well, we were working on one, and this idea of a commission. Look, I care about defending women's sports, and I said specifically in the letter that I'm really worried about what's happening in the collegiate level, although this did not apply to the collegiate level. And so making sure that our response is again aligned to the problem at hand, and making sure that we're considering the lives of everyone involved. And that's what I felt got lost on that last night. So we'll continue to work on this commission as a possibility and see where we land after the lawsuit is filed.
I'd like your thoughts on this. The final night of the legislative session when this passed, as the vote happened that night, they could not have overturned the veto, but there were obviously votes that flipped in the meantime. Why did that happen?
Well, I wasn't surprised by that at all, and we knew that would happen. If you listen to that last night, some of the people that voted against it were making the same argument that I made. They said, look, we haven't had time to look at this, and if we do something this hastily, we might make mistakes, so they voted against it. And indeed, there were mistakes made. That's why we had to change the bill. And so I wasn't surprised because there were now 2 weeks between when they made that vote. They did have an opportunity to hear from their constituency, and then they did have an opportunity to change the bill. So we did put a process in place that included the veto to allow them an opportunity to do it the right way.
I also heard a lot from lawmakers, as you just mentioned, that they heard from their constituents, and I heard that a lot of them got beat up over that no vote. Whether that's the loud minority or the majority? Hard to say, but did you feel that pressure as well?
Well, of course, and by the way, I do think it is the majority. I think the majority of people having to choose between one or the other are going to choose and end up on the side of making sure that we're protecting women's sports. However, I will also say that most people who read that letter and that I've had an opportunity to have a conversation with completely understand why the veto made sense. You can believe that this is the right policy and still believe that it's better to take this slow, better to let other states fund the $1 million lawsuits, and then again care for these kids. And I just have to continue to bring them up. This very, 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 very small group of kids that are under an enormous amount of pressure, that are really struggling right now, and making sure that they know that we love them, that we see them, and that we care about them.
Governor, moving on, what was the most important thing that the legislature did this year, in your opinion? Well,
I hate that HB 11 has kind of overshadowed everything, because there were dozens of incredible things that happened. But it's hard to pick one. I guess if I had to pick one, I would say education funding, because we had record education funding. But closely behind is a complete transformation in the way that we are approaching water policy in this state, in the middle of the biggest drought we've had in 1,200 years.
Let's talk about that a little more. A lot of us have been seeing those devastating images of Lake Powell, of the Great Salt Lake, and just how much they have both receded. How is what happened this year going to help reverse that?
Well, I think it's impossible to overstate what a transformation this was. We passed more water conservation legislation this year than the entire history of our state combined. And so it's of course funding. That's a huge piece of this. You talked about what's happening in Lake Powell, Great Salt Lake, making sure that we're getting more water to those lakes, funding to help farmers. Most of our water is still used for agriculture in this state, so that they can improve outcomes and utilize much less water. We have incentives for people to use water-wise landscaping, businesses to use water-wise landscaping, and then secondary water metering, which is something we haven't done in this state. So again, this is a complete 180 in the way that we look at water, and that's very positive and will help us for generations to come.
Okay, and obviously there's some personal responsibility behind this from each of us in the state as well. Governor, I wanted to hit on one last thing with you, the pain that everyone's feeling at the pump. People who were going paycheck to paycheck before all this started happening, I don't even know what type of impact this is having on them, but it's not good, obviously. What can be done from a state level to help alleviate some of the prices that we're seeing with these crazy gas prices? You've already talked about how the state gas tax is not an option there, so what is?
Sure. So we are pushing on the federal government, who has a much bigger impact on gas prices and energy development. But there are things that we can do here in the state. So as I've mentioned before, we did have a meeting with the Speaker and the President and many in the petroleum industry, talking about things that we can do short-term and long-term to decrease prices of gas at the pump. Our teams have met together this week. They're putting together some proposals. We're hoping in the next week or so we can look. It's going to be hard. We do taxes a little differently in the state. Some states are looking at removing taxes. We are looking at that as well, but we're trying to figure out, are there ways that we can help compensate, especially low-income families that are struggling right now? How can we get more money in their pockets to help pay for the gas and the food that they need so desperately as these prices are escalating across the country?
We have about 30 seconds left. Is this something that can happen soon? Because price is obviously really hurting people.
Yeah, we want to make these changes as soon as we possibly can. We're trying to figure out how much money we have available that we can get back to people. What will that look like? How will we do it? We're also looking at extending the free. We had free fare February for people that are riding tracks and other transit along the Wasatch Front. We're looking at extending that for additional months to help as well. So lots of things on the table.
All right, Governor, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Glenn.
Still to come, a new poll showing Senator Mike Lee has a big lead over his GOP challengers. We're breaking down those numbers and the latest on the race with our panel. But first, the call is growing to extend benefits to veterans who are suffering from the effects of burn pit exposure. The latest on the effort after the break. Welcome back. President Biden's budget director in the hot seat as lawmakers grill her over the newly released spending plan. The $5.8 trillion budget includes higher taxes for the wealthy and more money for education, public health, and law enforcement. Washington correspondent Hannah Brand explains how lawmakers are reacting to the proposal.
There's no shortage of Republican criticism for the Biden budget.
The American people are not going to buy this budget because, frankly, we can't afford it.
The White House calls the budget fiscally responsible. It aims to lower the federal deficit and would raise taxes on the ultra-wealthy. Office of Management and Budget Director Shalonda Young says that will balance the increased spending for things like education, law enforcement, and public health.
The other benefit of tax reform is we get to invest in the regular Americans who have price pressures.
At a hearing with Young, Republicans like Congressman Jason Smith and Ben Cline were quick to connect the proposed $5.8 trillion in spending to high inflation.
This budget does nothing to address inflation.
Doubling down on the delusion that the answer out of inflation is to spend more money.
But this budget is notably missing some of the major priorities from the president's previous agenda.
He's not giving up on his priorities that were outlined in the Build Back Better bill: lower cost child care, lower cost prescription drugs, lower cost health care premiums.
Instead, Senator Tim Kaine says President Biden is leaving that to Congress.
Letting us negotiate whether there will be a budget reconciliation vehicle to deal with some of those priorities. And he's put, I would say, a meat and potatoes budget on the table.
The presidential budget outlines priorities, but Congress ultimately controls how much is spent. So the details of the plan are likely to change through negotiations in the months ahead. In Washington, I'm Hannah Brand.
Congress is very close to passing a bill to get health benefits to burn pit victims. Washington correspondent Basil John reports on how the only thing now in the way is a vote in the Senate.
You serve today, we take care of you tomorrow. That is our oath.
New York Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand believes it is time for Congress to give burn pit victims the health care benefits they deserve.
Why are they waiting to get health care that they earned the minute they became service members?
Danielle Robinson still fights on behalf of her late husband, who was injured by burn pits, and says Congress needs to pass this to prevent any more suffering.
If you step in our shoes and live our reality, I don't know, it would be inhumane not to pass this bill.
The Honoring Our Pact Act would provide health care to 3.5 million veterans exposed to airborne hazards in burn pits and streamline the VA's review process.
The Honoring Our Pact Act is going to make sure we finally deliver the benefits, the high health quality care our veterans deserve without jumping through hoops.
The legislation passed in the House, and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer promises action soon in the Senate.
I will fully support the Honoring Our Pact Act, and the Senate will vote on it this Congress.
Activists like Jon Stewart and John Feal are urging senators to come together and pass what they call common sense legislation.
We need 10 Republicans. That's it. After 20 years of fighting, this is what it comes down to.
Put this bill on the floor and force feed them this bill.
Advocates want to see the bill passed before Memorial Day. Reporting in Washington, I'm Basil John.
Coming up, are Utah's two major political parties going to the extremes? Our panel debates after the break.
You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Time now for a closer look at some of the big stories of the week with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have State Representative Candace Perucci and former State Senator Scott Howe. Thank you to both of you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. Let's start off with the Senate race. Deseret News Hinckley Institute poll coming out during the week for Senator Lee's re-election bid shows him with a huge lead within GOP primary voters. 67% say if it were held today, they would vote again for the senator. We did see some movement, though, with challenger Becky Edwards, a former state legislator. She's now up to 19%. So she did come up quite a bit, and then the others were under 10%. Representative, let's start off with you. How are you seeing this race play out?
I definitely think Senator Lee will be the one to clinch the nomination. I mean, 67%
is a pretty massive lead, and with the state convention coming up in just a few weeks, I think that's a really hard gap to fill. And I'm supporting the senator in his bid for re-election, and I think he'll do a great job. And we'll have to see what the Democrat Party decides to do right now.
Yeah, we'll get into that in just a sec. One quick follow-up for you. Does this indicate that conservative Republicans and even moderate Republicans are backing Senator Lee?
I certainly think so. I think that at the end of the day, people are able to look at Senator Lee's record and see what he's done as senator, see what he stood for, and that they support him. And we're seeing a huge wave right now of conservatives and I would say Republicans re-engaging in the process and becoming more heavily involved. So I'm eager to see that at the polls, but I do think he'll do really well in the primary.
Scott, let's bring you in as a Democrat watching this race. How are you seeing it play out?
Well, first of all, I think that Becky Edwards moving up as far as she did and collecting the amount of signatures that she got, she'll be on the ballot, so we know that for sure. And you know, I knew Mike's father really well, and Mike has just not been that characteristic of the team player. I was absolutely chagrined at what he did in the in the SCOTUS hearings with nominee Judge Brown Jackson. And I still can't get over the Moroni statement, the Trump, and his support for Trump. You know, I want to be in politics that represent a centrist viewpoint, not this far extreme. And I think Mike has made some pretty big errors that I wouldn't be a bit surprised that it is a tougher battle once they get in that primary. And we know that Becky has a record. And she's a moderate, she's smart, she listens, and I think our senator has not played to the center of the state. He's played to that far extreme. That is kind of who's controlling the Republican Party right now.
Okay, quick follow-up for you, Scott. It looks like Allie Isom will likely make the ballot as well. She turned in the signatures. She was getting around 4% in this poll. The primary election is coming up quick. Is there enough time to gain the ground they would need to? Well, especially when you consider both of them potentially on the ballot against Senator Lee.
Well, and that's where the division is between those two. And for a lot of months, people have been talking to both of them and saying, would one of you please drop out? But they feel a conviction that they want to run, and that's the democratic process that we have for democracy. Can they make up that delta, that gap? If anybody could do it, I think former Representative Becky Edwards might be the one to pull that off.
Representative, I'd like to get your thoughts on what Scott said about Senator Lee's track record. Do you believe he is representing the people of Utah the way he should?
So I think Senator Lee has been very open that he's running as a Republican, a constitutional conservative, and I think he has done just that. And I will speak to, I think, to what was discussed earlier, you do have two people who are going to fracture votes of anyone who is opposing Mike Lee. And so I think it makes it nearly impossible for them at this point, where the numbers are, to get that across the finish line. But I know that in my area, the Harriman-Riverton area, Senator Lee is very well respected and appreciated for his service. And again, I think there is value in having different viewpoints obviously representing us. And we have two very different flavors of state senators right now. You have Senator Mike Lee and you have Senator Mitt Romney, right? Both have their strengths that they're able to, and the voters are aware of that. And I do think that Senator Lee does have the support from our state that will get him ultimately across the finish line in November.
You know, Candace brings up a really interesting point. The Republican Party, it's almost as fractured as the Democratic Party. You've got Mitt Romney, who's
I don't think that's what she said.
That's not what I said at all.
Well, I mean, in terms of the far right and the far left.
No, I'm saying that we're a big tent party, like Ronald Reagan envisioned, where you could have a Mitt Romney and a Mike Lee representing the same state. But it doesn't mean we're fractured.
Well, and maybe that's the wrong word, but there's such a uniqueness where Mitt Romney came out and said, you know, I'm not going to support Mike Lee. I mean, he made that statement. And he's going to bow out of it. So to me, maybe fracture is not the right word, but it's not a unifying thing. And don't get me wrong.
Definitely two different approaches.
Yes.
To these two senators. I would really like to dig into that, but I need to move on to something more, Scott. There's a very interesting strategy playing out in a potential general election matchup. Democrats within the party are saying, let's not field the candidate and let's put our support behind independent Evan McMullin. Why is that happening?
Oh, wow. It's happening because when we went to our caucus, the conversation wasn't about Evan McMullen. It was anybody but Mike Lee. And that's what we heard from table to table to table. And the reality is a Democrat can't win in Utah. And I've tried it twice. And especially in this contentious environment that we have. And Kel Weston is a great guy. He is a tremendously talented and very well equipped to be a United States Senator. The reality is a Democrat just can't win in this state. So the plan is, and Congressman McAdams and Mayor Wilson have been behind this to say, let's at least take a shot and see if we can get Democrats to cross over and vote for Evan McMullen, and that would be a better shot at taking on Mike Lee. And I hope it doesn't fracture the Democratic Party. I can use that word there.
Yes, you can. You're free to do that. Lost my train of thought there. Okay, Representative Perucci, when you take a look at this, what's going on with the Democrats saying abandon our candidate and get behind independent, what kind of message does that send to you? But also, I want to point out real quick that when you take a look at polling numbers, Senator Lee's do come down when you take a look at the general election electorate compared to the primary electorate.
Thanks for the question, Glenn. So part of the campaign process is an opportunity for a party as a whole to share its message. And for Republicans, it's limited government and self-governance and individual liberty and economic freedom. And it's interesting to see that Democrats aren't using this as an opportunity to also tout the things that they stand for their platform. So as a strategy to just abandon your party's candidate and shift to an independent, while it certainly is a way of consolidating votes, I think it's an interesting move as a party to not just stand on your party platform and run your candidate, instead pivoting to an independent.
Address that, Scott, because it is an interesting move.
Oh, yeah. It's all about being able to win. That's what it is.
And my question for you, though, Scott, is the Democratic Party connecting with average Utahns?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what we define as an average Utahn. If it's the far extreme right that are all Trumpers, then I would say no. I think there's a middle ground in there that's not really being heard.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are more unaffiliated voters in the state of Utah than Democratic voters.
That's exactly.
So are they appealing to them at all? I guess would be a better question.
Well, I think that's why you see so many unaffiliated right now, because they've left the Republican Party and they're looking for that candidate that will be able to do that. And the proof of the pudding was what happened out in Davis County, where you had a moderate Republican like Steve Handy who was just eviscerated in that. And he didn't even think that he had any problems. But it was the far extreme right that took him out of that. And you see now that we've got a Representative Garf Ballard, excuse me, and then you have even Jerry Stevenson, who's probably one of the most moderate, top thinking. They're all in primaries now.
Push to primaries.
Exactly.
Representative, address that, because that was an interesting development that we saw play out at the Davis County Convention. Is that a sign of where the Utah GOP is headed?
So we have 29 counties in Utah, and we're just talking about one different area, an area I don't represent or have any close ties to Davis County. Obviously, as has been mentioned, Representative Handy, I greatly respect him and appreciate his service to our state, is more of a moderate. And so I was surprised to see he didn't choose to collect signatures, which is a way of guaranteeing that you'll have a spot on the ballot. But I don't think it's fair to characterize that the new wave of individuals getting involved are fringe, crazy pants right people. I think most people don't engage in government unless two things happen. One, your individual freedoms are impacted, which during COVID we've had restrictions and lockdowns and things in place and quarantines that have really upset folks, and they're definitely feeling their individual freedoms pressured and taken away from. And then the second is when government starts impacting your wallet. And as we're seeing on a national level with inflation through the roof and gas prices through the roof, people are really starting to feel it. And that's when you get a groundswell of individuals checking in to a political process that they generally have been checked out of. So I will be curious to see what happens at our other conventions.
We could go on this. I should have reserved the whole show for the two of you, but unfortunately I did not, and we have run out of time. Really good conversation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks to Representative Perucci.
And thank you for staying with us, and do so, because we'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave you now with a look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. The Utah Republican and Democratic parties are hosting state conventions later this month. Both are set for Saturday, April 23rd. Ballots for the primary election will start to go out the week of June 7th, and then Election Day is Tuesday, June 28th. Make sure to connect with me on social media. I'd like to know what you think of this show and other issues that are important to you. You can email me at InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.